Hello and welcome to the Beyond Shakespeare podcast. I'm your host, Robert Crichton, General Overseer of the podcast, which specialises in creating full-cast audio adaptations of drama from before 1642, as well as providing background and other production resources. You can support our work and get a say into what we produce by becoming a patron today. Go to www.patreon.com/Beyond Shakespeare. Today it's time for more discussion about the York Corpus Christi play, which it's highly possible you've actually seen, can see, have been involved in at some point in time. The York Pageants get about a bit. And so, if you've produced or been involved in the staging of a York pageant, or any early play that fits our remit, don't hesitate to get in touch. We love to help archive the practical side of producing plays with, shall we say, a slightly thinner production history. Usually things with a thinner production history than York, but hey, what can you do? You can email me at admin@beyondshakespeare.org and say hello. So today's episode is a discussion with
Christina Fitzgerald, and I am a professor of English at the University of Toledo in Toledo, Ohio. My research specialty is late medieval English literature, particularly drama, and also some manuscript studies as well. My first book was called The Drama of Masculinity and Medieval English Guild Culture, and I still work on masculinity, particularly mercantile masculinity. And most of what I work on is 15th even into the 16th century, but I teach everything in the medieval English period. I'm the only medievalist in my department, so I teach from Beowulf to the early Tudor drama.
So today's episode is about her edited selection of the York Corpus Christi play, published by Broadview Press. It's a lovely, accessible edition, relatively cheap, easy to hold in the hand, a really good entry point to medieval biblical drama. There's nothing like an unglossed original spelling edition to send the first-timer running for the hills, and this edition is nothing like that. It isn't all the plays, but if you all go out and buy this one, and then email Broadview for more, who knows, maybe they'll commission work on the rest. Before we dive into our chat, first a massive apology. This was recorded so long ago, I can't even remember if it was this year or not. The lead time on these episodes has normally been about a month, sometimes two, but over 6 months is slightly taking the biscuit, so sorry for the delay. Sorry. It should also be noted that we were briefly joined by Dr. Fitzgerald's dog, who has been mostly edited out, but does pop in occasionally. But that's enough of me. Here's Dr. Christina M. Fitzgerald on the York Corpus Christi play, recorded in late 2018, though it might have been this year, might have been 2019. So, could you tell me about the York Mystery Plays and your edition, and how you came around to edit your edition of, 27 plays are in that?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah.
I have to look at the back of the book myself. Yes, 27.
I did count them and everything.
Yeah.
So how did you come to be editing this particular edition?
Well, I started actually editing a couple of the plays for the Broadview Anthology of English Literature, right? They have a larger anthology, and they have a medieval period volume to that larger anthology. And when it first came out, they'd done a really good job on the drama that was in there. And so I wrote them a note and said how terrific the drama section was compared to other anthologies. And they said, great, would you like to add some more to it? And so I said, sure. And I think the York Crucifixion was the first one I did. So I edited a few plays for them for the larger anthology. And then they asked me and John Sebastian, my co-editor, to do the Broadview Anthology of Medieval Drama. So we worked on that together. I think that came out in 2012. And then that was such a big hit that they asked me if I would do the York Corpus Christi play in a standalone volume as a kind of offshoot of the anthology, since I'd done a lot of it. I did more of the York plays for the medieval drama anthology. And then I just kept doing more and expanded it and made it its own edition along with some ancillary related texts as well. So that's how it came to be.
So
So
it was a sort of
sorry.
evolution, an evolutionary arc of encroaching Yorkness.
Yes. Exactly. And when I started editing for them, they knew that I was, a researcher, a specialist in these plays. My first book was about York and Chester, and so they knew I knew what I was talking about.
Ah, Chester. Yes, we've done a lot on Chester.
Oh yeah.
So we've been doing over the years. Started 5 years ago. I just thought, oh, Chester. We'll just do some read-throughs of Chester.
Yeah, that's right. I saw that. Yeah.
And sort of just flung ourselves into that before quite appreciating the editorial challenges that would bring about. Oh, I wish we'd started with the End Town play. That would have been that would have been so much more straightforward and more appropriate for where I live.
Where do you live, by the way?
I'm based in East Anglia, so
Okay.
starting with some East Anglian plays might have
Yes,
been a slightly more logical thing to do. We have
right, something like the Digby Mary Magdalene play, or
exactly.
yes, yeah.
It's just one of those things. I mean, it's been absolutely fascinating. I know York reasonably well. I've done the Crucifixion and other bits and bobs in my practice, but no, we haven't as of yet done that sort of work on it, which is why I wanted to talk to you about your work with it. When it comes to editing an edition, what's your approach in terms of how modernized do you go? What's your approach to language?
Yes.
How do you present a text like this to a modern audience?
Well, so the method started with the anthology of medieval drama, the Broadview anthology of medieval drama. So John and I both came to the conclusion that there was, well, I was about to say no reason, not no reason, but for an anthology that is for the classroom, for beginning students, there wasn't a good reason to keep Middle English spelling. And one of the things that we said was, the early modernists are not keeping early modern spelling in their place, right? A Shakespeare text has modernized spelling. And the York plays, for example, their text is from the 15th century, so it is a century earlier, a little more than a century earlier than Shakespeare's plays. But a lot of the plays we were doing for the anthology were contemporaneous, the text, with Shakespeare or some of his earlier the earlier playwrights from after the theaters. So we thought, well, why are we using a different method than the early modernists are? Why not make this more accessible? And so we did. And of course, also we had some text in there in translation too. And so with the anthology, we modernized the spelling. And so I continued that as the Broadview method with the York play as well. And so when I do that, generally, and this is, again, was the method for the anthology too, is to use the spelling in the Oxford English Dictionary's head note, right? So I'd start with the medieval word. What's the, how's the modern version of that spelled in the OED? And I use that spelling. Occasionally there's a word that's too obsolete, right? It's just a Middle English word. It didn't survive past the 15th century. And I have to kind of, just use the rules of modern spelling, or occasionally sometimes I would just keep it as the Middle English and gloss it. But that was rare. Most of the words we still have around, even if, if we don't have them in our speech anymore, they lasted, a few more centuries. And so we're used to seeing them in modernized spelling in other texts, in early modern texts. So that was my general method with the modernizing of the spelling. In other terms, other ways of presenting it to a modern audience, one of the things that I wanted to do with my edition was to think of my own students in terms of how much I gloss and note and explain. And I try not to overwhelm them with glosses, but basically if it hasn't been glossed that page, it gets a gloss, even if it's been glossed like a page before, right? So if you read some glossed editions of early texts, like, a Chaucer text or something like that, especially like the old Riverside Chaucer edition that we used to use in classrooms all the time. They assume that you're reading the text in order, and they stop glossing common words after a while. But of course, that's not always how you teach it. And students don't always commit those things to memory, right? And so they forget what these very common little but weird words mean, and they lose understanding. So in my edition, it's glossed all the way through, right? If it hasn't been glossed on that page, it gets a gloss if it's a weird word, obsolete word, so that they're just never lost in the text, that they have a guide through it. The other thing is, just in terms of layout, there is another modernized spelling edition out there. It has different play selections too, so there are other differences with my edition.
Are we talking the Oxford Classics?
Yes, exactly. It's an excellent edition, and I relied on it when I was a student. But its glosses are at the bottom of the page, and that drives my students nuts. That drives me nuts. So my glosses, and this was in the anthology too, our glosses are on the side of the page with the line that they belong to.
I am a huge fan of side glosses.
Yes,
I find it so useful, and it's that thing of, even when we were doing Chester regularly, and there's a 5-year gap between when we started and when we actually picked it up again.
Yeah,
you just forget. You go,
yes.
I know what this means, and I vaguely know from context, but I'm going to have to go to the and the frustration.
Yeah, like my Chaucer students, when I used to use the Riverside Chaucer, the eka, which means also, right? But of course it's spelled like eek, a mouse, like eek. And my students, they stopped, the editors of the Riverside Chaucer stopped glossing that after a few texts, and they're like, what does this word mean? It's everywhere. But words like that, I continue to gloss throughout the entire edition. And there's more explanatory notes, right? I try not to assume a lot of knowledge, particularly religious knowledge, knowledge of historical figures and things like that. So I try it, and I don't want to overwhelm it. Don't want to have interpretive glosses where possible. Just informative. Who is this person? What are they doing here?
Yes,
that sort of thing.
You do get occasionally some very, very obscure biblical references cropping up,
right.
And it's going, no, I'm at a loss. Even I know
the
Bible reasonably well, but who? And why is this here?
Yeah. And obscure language and stuff, and obscure theological ideas and things like that. There were a few things that threw me that I had to really work through to figure out what was going on with the text. But
yeah, so it's that thing of trying to the text presents so many potential barriers to the reader, or the potential performer, or whoever's accessing it. That sort of balancing act between how much do you put in, how much do you assume. When you're talking about modernizing spelling, where do you then sit with rhyming? Because that's where it's always the end of the line that's the problem.
Right. Most of the time. So again, I took early modern texts as my model, right? If you read a John Donne sonnet, all of his words are not going to rhyme in modern English. And even if you spelled them in early modern spelling, you still have to know how those sounds are pronounced to know that they rhyme, or that they did rhyme for him, right? And so, I basically kind of, a lot of times the rhyme is not lost. It still stays in some way, even, the vowel sounds have changed, but both have changed in the same way. And so they still rhyme, or it's at least a slant rhyme or a half rhyme, right? And so it's not a translation, right? It's just a modernized spelling. So the rhyme is still generally apparent. And every now and then you get something that wouldn't rhyme, even if unless you know the Middle English pronunciation, even if you kept the original spelling. And so it doesn't rhyme in the modernized spelling either. Or again, it's a slant rhyme. It's close enough.
Yeah. Oh yes, the words. Yes, that'll do. So in the rehearsal, I know that's not in your universe. In the acting universe, is sort of that's close enough. That'll scan.
Right. So I'm looking. Yeah, scanning actually. Some of that gets a little lost in the modernizing, but honestly, the York plays are not that regular, and of course, you get the long alliterative lines where it's not metered at all. I was just flipping through some pages to find an example. So I found an example. This is on pages 138 and 139. It's in the Herod and the Magi and the Offering of the Magi plays, and the second of the Three Kings says lines that rhyme on nothing and spring. Okay, that's fine. And then young and king. So young, right, doesn't rhyme strictly in modern English with spring and nothing and king, but you still get that sound, right?
Yeah.
It's a half rhyme. It's close enough.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So in terms of, because of the way, in a sense, this edition has evolved from individual selections, I mean, how did you come up with your, because it's quite tricky deciding what your selection is going to be.
Yes.
Because I was sort of looking at it going, so you've done, and you've sort of, there's sort of the early life of Jesus and the later life, and the post-resurrection stuff is mostly left to one side, and which
there's a little bit of that. There's right.
That's the closest I can sort of say of going, but they are all, frankly, not my favourite, most exciting plays in the universe. Most of them.
Really? Really? What's your favourite?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'm always a bit of a sucker for all of the interpretations of Joseph. I quite like Joseph's sort of useless fecklessness that sort of comes through quite a few of the plays.
Yeah. I've got Joseph's troubles about Mary. Yeah. So that's. But I don't have the flight into Egypt, and he's kind of feckless there too.
Yeah, it seems to be very much a thing that he's. Again, I'm going to the end town where he genuinely is just a miserable sod.
He's worse there than in York.
He is. Yes. So. I again also very interested in all the Virgin Mary plays. Death of Mary, the Assumption at the end, which is it's lovely that they're
yes.
We've got that. You've got no coronation, but that's sort of not quite all there, is it? If I remember off the top of my head.
And there's a question of space, right? And so
absolutely. Yeah.
So, but there was a conscious choice. I made a conscious choice to include more Mary plays because that's one thing that the Oxford edition doesn't have. No. And then also Christ's appearance to Mary Magdalene is kind of standing in for the post resurrection stuff. So I was emphasizing the women more than the men. So, which makes my edition different, right, from other editions.
I mean, it's interesting. I'm sort of tempted not to say the Crucifixion as a play because it's interesting having done that, of actually finding. I like the wrong word is like. I like the evilness of it, but I do also find it incredibly one-notey all the way through in a way that I find very. It was very hard rehearsing it. I remember finding that it really jarred in a way that some of the other plays didn't. I might not put this out on the podcast, by the way. I'm supposed to be emphatically positive about everything.
No, that's okay. I'll be positive about it. And we can be, bad cop, good cop.
Yeah.
Anyway.
But I remember when we rehearsed it, it was, and I know it's supposed to be, and I know it fits within a framework of other things going on, and so there's light and dark as pageants follow pageants. But I remember thinking, God, this is hard work.
Yeah.
And organising.
Well, that's perfect, actually.
Yeah.
Because the crucifier's complaining about the hard work.
Well, I have to say, doing the play, one does come away with a great respect for the Roman army. Because it was genuine. I mean, okay, they didn't have to do a risk assessment, but risk assessing a crucifixion.
Yes, that's true.
Doing it safely, we didn't actually want to kill our actor.
Sorry, I was going to say that's a weirdly funny play, so I think it is.
Anyway. It is that sense of the workers just all standing around going, it's 2 weeks tops,
Okay, so I actually like that play. So I can see it, but our perspectives are very different. So as a performer and a director, you don't like it. And I'm thinking of it more as a teacher and a scholar. And it teaches really well. even by itself. Like if it's the only medieval drama or only York play that I, in a survey class that I'm doing, it shows students like that weird mix of the humor in one of the most serious events in the whole Christian narrative, right? The strange mix of tones, like you said, the light and the dark. But it also is really interesting to think in terms of space and to get students up and acting it out and to get them to see how cues for actions are in the language itself because the crucifiers say what they're doing, right, and where they are. I'll take the head, I'll take the right leg or the right arm, I'll take the left arm, I'll take the feet, things like that. And so it teaches really beautifully and gets a lot of different aspects of medieval drama across. And then also the anachronism, right? The fact that they're speaking very much like 15th century York workmen, like the very craftsmen who are putting on the plays and merchants too. But that sense of the theme of work that runs through the whole cycle is there in the crucifixion. So to me, it's not only theologically central, it's also and narratively central. It's also central to what the York plays themselves are doing. So I couldn't have imagined an edition with that without it in it.
Oh no, I'm not suggesting that. And to be fair, it's not that I don't like the play. I just was surprised. Actually, it's how I think it's bigged up, as it were, and I was expecting it to be just I don't know what I was expecting. I think that's more my objection to it was that I was expecting something different or I don't know.
It's interesting too because it is the only dramatic crucifixion scene, or as far as I know, well, no, I guess artistic, that's too broad a generalization, but it's definitely the only dramatic crucifixion scene where it's just the crucifiers and Christ, where there's no death of Christ in the same play. Death of Christ is a separate play, right? And the mourners are in a separate play. So Mary and John, or the three Marys and John, are not there, right? It's all men. And isolating that moment does something different with it that the conventional way of depicting it in the Middle Ages doesn't do, right? It takes away the mourning. It just makes it about the suffering and the torture and
the mechanics.
The mechanics, and then the weird concentration on the crucifiers, which then, of course, also, it makes theological sense because what it's focusing on is that sin crucifies Christ, right? And so all of their lack of empathy, their narcissism, their selfishness, and their cruelty, right? That is what is abstractly crucifying him as well as what is literally crucifying him. So it focuses on that instead of the mourning of his death. And so it's interesting to me too because it's weird, right? It's weird in its own day, and it's weird to my students. That's why I like it.
I love the medieval imagination because there's so much weird in all of the various pageants that we have. Some of them are just beautifully bizarre.
That's why I'm a medievalist, because everything's weird.
Time is an illusion. You can throw any, because that genre isn't quite the same thing that we think of as later. So you throw anything into the pot. You've got so many options actually that later theatres to some degree doesn't, because it's actually enclosed in theatres, just to annoy the early modernists.
Yes.
It's downhill from here, guys.
No, I think that's true. I think there's a closing down of possibilities. I think that's true not just in drama from the medieval to the early modern, but in literature in general, right? Like there's a narrowing of a sense of what you can do.
Yes, it's because we haven't talked about the actual ways these might have been staged, but just as an opening gambit is to say, how did medieval people stage plays? Well, the basic answer is however they well liked.
Yes, there's many different ways of staging medieval plays. The York plays were staged a particular way, right? Yeah. But that was just one of the options.
Yeah, and we have that antiquarian idea of and that's how plays were done. Everything was on carts, and they did it. No, we just have a really good example of or some good examples of that's how they did it. But other ways, however, whatever worked. And as a practitioner, that's the rule of theatre is, as long as it works, it doesn't matter.
And one time, I'm not sure it went over that well, but I presented a paper at the New Chaucer Society a few years ago called Putting the Cart Before the Play. Because sometimes I think maybe they decided, let's do a play on carts before they decided what the play was. Like that doing the pageant wagons in the city streets and making it processional staging shapes what then happens with the text, right? So plays that aren't done that way are, have different character to them than the York plays or the Chester plays. That they certainly anyway exploit the possibilities of the processional wagon performance, the fact that multiple plays are playing at once, and you might actually hear some sounds coming from one down the street while you're watching the other. So like, while you're watching the Three Kings Adore Christ, you might hear the innocents being slaughtered, just down the road or around the corner or whatever.
And it's, again, that sense of time all happening. Everything's happening at the same time. And that's where, when we talk about just internal anachronisms, when people are swearing by Christ's blood, hundreds of years before you've been born.
It's all timey-wimey and wibbly-wobbly.
Yes. Oh, good. We're getting Doctor Who references in. That's always good. A lot of my work runs rather like telesnap reconstructions, so it's all very fun. Yeah, I'm very much interested in how form decides content. That the way these plays are written are dictated by the fact they're outdoors. You may be in a space which is actually quite acoustically good, but you may not, and therefore. The way the verse is structured, the way the lines, the way information is delivered, is it's all contained. Here is a stanza; it is telling you this. We move on to another stanza; it is telling you that, and there's repetition deliberately in place because your odds on going to miss a lot.
Yeah. And you've got characters who have to like clear a path through the crowd because people are entering from the ground to the wagon, right? Yes. And so they actually say make way, right? They're usually the tyrants who are saying get out of my way.
Yes.
But it's also practical. It's useful, right?
Yes.
And necessary.
And it's also in defense when people are saying well, later playwrights were able to work much more sophisticated way. I'm going, they had complete control of their space.
Yes, yeah.
You can do extended simile and metaphor when you are surrounded by walls.
Right.
And you can control what you are doing. You can't, if you handed those writers, and you see it sometimes with street entertainments and the big extravaganzas that you get, where a playwright will write in one style for a theatre and then write in a totally different style for the outdoors. And you go, well, it's his job. He's not an idiot. And it's the thing.
Yeah.
It's this idea of progression is just no. It's just different things.
Yeah, so to take two medieval examples, right? The play Mankind is full of puns, is richly rhetorical, and that it was probably played in a tight. We don't know for sure.
No.
I mean, there've been all sorts of arguments about inn yards and things like that, but it would work beautifully in a great hall, right, where everybody's going to hear those puns, right, and understand them, as opposed to truly outdoor space and where you've got people selling their wares and stuff like that going on at the same time as well. Mankind versus York. I was going to go back to York, right? So York. I mean, it has some moments of metaphor, but it tends less to use language metaphorically and symbolically and use space and action more, right? And so does Mankind. But I think York relies on the space and the action more, and then Mankind can do all sorts of fun stuff with language that York doesn't too. What York does is have repeated patterns of diction, like all the language about work that runs through the whole cycle, obviously is kind of, all the language of the guilds in general is, called up economic language, various synonyms for work, buying and selling. But it's through repetition that you pick up that, right? Because like you're saying, right, you're not going to hear it the first, the second, maybe by the third time you'll realize, oh, wait, I've heard that before, and then it keeps going, and so you notice it. But it can't do the subtle punning and the subtle complex, conceits and things like that. Whereas mankind can, because it's in a smaller and possibly indoor space where it can control the sound.
I was going to ask. Obviously, you've expressed an opinion on the crucifixion. Any other favourites? Yeah, it's hard work. It's very hard work. When you cast it, it is a case of going, okay, Roman soldiers. Okay, anyone got any back problems?
Yeah, I can imagine. Yeah, I think I might be misremembering this, but because it's continental, I swear there's a case of, it might even be modern, of a Judas actually dying in a...
actually hanging himself, yes.
Yeah,
yes,
I
don't know if he died, but there was a rope malfunction.
Yes. Yeah. Anyway,
yes,
so I can imagine malfunctions with the crucifixion too, like the cross falling over and things like that.
Oh, it's a nightmare. Do you know the story when the National did it in the late 70s, early 80s?
I know that. I mean, I know of that production. But I know the story.
The company was notoriously pissed most of the time. The bar
in the British sense, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Trolleyed. You had some historic drinkers in that company. And of course it's Promenade, and they're manhandling the cross, and there was a case where all 4 people manhandling the cross and Jesus were all inebriated. And suddenly there was a realization within the building that maybe having a whacking great bit of wood over 50, 60 people on the floor, paying audience members, might not be a safe thing to do.
Good Lord.
And if you wish to learn more about the National Theatre production of The Mysteries, I can recommend Impossible Plays by Keith Dewhurst and Jack Shepherd. The story of the crucifixion incident can be found on pages 214 and 215. Anyway, getting back to my question, other favourite plays in the York?
I am really fond of the flood. I like the building of the Ark too. And again, York does something weird there in separating the two stories, right? And so the building becomes just men again. This is my first book, right? The plays are all about men. Yeah. But anyway, so then I made my edition more about women to kind of balance it. But which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But
yes.
So it separates the two narratives, which is interesting, and then makes the building of the Ark kind of an enacted metaphor of craftsmanship. And then in the flood, there's a little bit of the comic, Punch and Judy Uxor Noah, the wife of Noah stuff. But she's actually she's sadder. She's much more empathetic. And she says, I have tools to trust. I have to go back to town and gather my tools, which is a line that I'm interested in, because it often gets glossed as domestic tools, and it just says tools. And so I didn't gloss it. I just left it as tools. I'll let the students decide what tools she might be gathering, but which suggests that she also has a craft or a work, right, that then is getting ignored by the play and by everything that's going on. She's mad at Noah for not letting her in on this, and she uses all sorts of language again. You can probably hear my dog barking in the background.
Your dog, yes.
I'm sorry. So she gets mad at Noah for not letting her in, and she actually uses all sorts of kinds of language of economics and guilds to say that. She said it was a bad bargain. There's a couple other words in there too. So I read that play as her being a part of the guild, but being left out of the decision making. And then she's mournful about her kin and cousins and friends that are just being left to die.
Yes.
Like, why don't they get to come on the Ark? And and I feel like we're supposed, like most traditionally critics read the Uxor, I'm going to stop saying that word because I can't say it, the wife of Noah, as representative of sin and of not getting it, and then the Ark is the church, and then once she's on the Ark, she's saved by the church. And in the York plays, I think it's different. I don't think that works. I think it's saying, no, the will of God is difficult and hard, and faith is confusing and terrifying and sometimes makes you sad. And And I think the audience is supposed to identify with her because, of course, that's what their position would be. They'd be like, what? God's talking to you? Sure, Noah, whatever you say. I'm concerned about these people I love, right?
Yeah.
That's the human response to the immensity and unknowability and weirdness of God. Anyway, sorry.
Well, especially with these all of the Old Testament stories where sometimes trying to find the moral is an interesting, fun game where we've just done a fair number of readings of Abraham and Isaac, which is, where I still think my favourite line from one of my readers was basically, Isaac, he's been through this serial killer entrapment situation before. And that's absolutely right. All the games that you would have in a modern psychological, torture sort of situation of just going, there's something quite disturbing. I'm trying to think of the other floods of whether anyone ever really talks about the genocide. You sometimes see the gossips getting drunk.
Chester.
But I'm just trying to think of the others as well. Do they actually ever really go into the genocide in the way that the difficultness of what they're doing, rather than the technical challenge of surviving themselves?
No, I think York comes closest in her. Because I think it's even after, if I recall, it's even after they've found land that she's still thinking about them, or at least after she's on the ark. And so it's subtle. It's not really obvious, and I think in performance it depends on, in a modern performance, I think an actor could make it more obvious, in a crowded street in 15th century York. I don't know, but it's there in the text.
Well, it's again the problem of the text that we have is that a lot of it is just the dialogue of the primary.
Yeah.
We don't, we've got a lot of evidence about staging and costumes and the physical things that go with it, but in terms of how many stage directions does York go for? I'm trying to think of whether it's a very stage direction-y one.
It's not. There's things like there's a stage direction in the Resurrection for Christ rising. It just says in Latin he rises.
Yeah, helpful.
Yeah. It's stuff like that. It's about movement, and it's few and far between.
How does music play into this? How much does it come into it much?
We put music on we chose a page with music for the cover image to remind people that music does play a part in these plays, and in a way that's, I think, been partly overlooked. My co-editor for the anthology, John Sebastian, works on this much more than I do, so I'm not as expert in it. But there's all sorts of cues for music where we know what it's a common liturgical song or something like that, so we know what it would be.
Yeah.
But then there's suggestions of music, and we don't know what they might have used. And I think there's much, much more of it than even the surviving text suggests. And there's all sorts of ways, where practically some stage business could be covered by music, right? And where it makes sense to use music. And then there's the stuff like the Mary plays, and that's another reason why I included them. On the page, some of those Mary plays seem really dull, right? But if you realize that there's music and a kind of spectacular action and pageantry, then it becomes much, much more interesting. And so I think it's been to our detriment that we haven't thought about how much music is in these plays. When they're performed with music, I think it becomes almost more like something like dance or musical than just strictly drama, because I think movement plays a big part with that music as well.
With the ritualistic elements, you again, I'm thinking too. Yeah. I think it's N-Town where some of the Mary play within that. There is almost an oratorio sort of pops in the middle of it.
For example, the Assumption of Mary. There's this bit where the angels sing, and there's a Latin line that cues the music. But as I note in my note, the source of this hymn is unknown. It is unique to the York plays, right? And then, but even as the angels are speaking, they all have one line after another, all 12 of them, and then for some reason Angel 8 gets an extra line. I'm not sure why, but
I've noticed that one thing about angels is that the number of angels usually seems to go up or down quite randomly.
Yes,
And I
true.
think it's simply because you can always throw in another angel.
Yeah, that's true. Or you can, if one doesn't
Little
show up.
Timmy needs a line.
Yeah.
Give someone. Let's split some material up, and another angel will be fine.
That's probably true. But anyway, all their lines, it's anaphora, right? They all start with the same word, rise, rise, rise,
Mm.
and then there's a few lines of come. And then Thomas does something similar where every one of his lines starts with hail. And even though those are spoken and not sung, the rhythmic and repetitive quality of them works like, it's poetry. It works like music, but it also, like you were saying, it's ritual too, right? A repeated word chanted almost. Yes, that plays very different than something like the Flood play, where it's a much more kind of naturalistic or potentially naturalistic emotional kind of identification with characters, and as opposed to a kind of ritual spectacle. But there's a little bit I feel like the York plays, if you're a person watching the whole cycle, if you don't like one play, you'll like the next one, right? Or something down the line. And if you lived in 15th or 16th century York, and this happened every year for you, you might not go see the whole thing. You'd just go see your favorites, right? And you can see them in any order you wanted. You don't have to see them
And
linearly.
it's in your mood of the day. You can
Yeah.
opt out, go for some food, come back again.
Yep.
It's like sort of pick your own adventure kind of day out.
Yeah. I think only a crazy person like me would watch it from beginning to end, which I did when Toronto did a production in 1998.
Yeah.
And I'd never seen any of them performed, and I was writing my dissertation on them, so I sat there and watched every play from 6 a.m. to like 10 at night, and boy, was that exhausting.
Yes. Oh, but there's always a hardcore who will do that for any event as well. Who say, I am going to see this. I'm going to see it all. I'm going to see every iteration, and I will get the full experience, and I don't care if I will be unconscious for a week.
Yeah, and I suspect in a culture of pilgrimage and other penitential actions in the 15th and 16th centuries, that you had people then who did that as well, right? Like, I am going to show my devotion to God by standing here all day long watching every play.
So we keep saying we're going to talk about women.
Yes.
Women. I think there's a whole series of questions really we can ask, but just the general depiction of women in these plays, and how does that affect a modern reader audience? Is that a fair question?
Yeah, I think that's something I deal with when I teach. So when I, was first writing about these plays in my dissertation, my first book, I was, seeing them as being all about men. The, very male-oriented guilds that were producing them were kind of, working out their own identities through them in a lot of ways. And I actually felt like women took a back seat to the men. But when I put this edition together, I wanted to get more of the plays emphasizing women in there. And so, the Virgin Mary narrative stuff, and then Mary Magdalene as well, and the wife of Noah, and Eve, of course, too. And I started to see that there is actually a kind of a second narrative of the women through the cycle, and that through the emphasis on Mary at the end of the plays, with so many plays about Mary, I think it actually calls that what was subtext in the early part of the cycle. It kind of calls it back up to the level of text, and they become much more prominent by the end. And I think that, again, York does some weird things, and all those plays focused on the Virgin Mary at the end are one of the weird things that it does. It's different from Chester, the other guild produced full cycle. And I think what it does with the wife of Noah and what it does with Eve is a little different as well. Both of them, I think, are less caricatured, less just the sinful woman or the symbol of sin, and more complex human characters, and that show the difficulty of not sinning, right? The difficulty of choosing the righteous path, and make the audience kind of empathize with their choices and see themselves in them. And so it's interesting to me that when the play does focus on women, it seems to kind of make them a point of identification and an entry into this world, right? They're the everymen, right? Instead it's every woman. Well, and also Joseph, old Joseph. So old men and women are the every men and women of the plays. But for the Middle Ages, old men practically were kind of womanish, so they kind of get lumped in with the women, especially since he can play no game. I guess that's the Chester Joseph. Chester Joseph says, I can play no game anymore, which is his way of saying that he's impotent.
Yes.
Right. I forget what the line.
The whole, I think Mary in N Town, I think the whole Mary play within there.
Yeah.
But
that's
the interplay
also a very woman-oriented play.
Oh, hugely.
Yeah.
But it's also the way that Joseph weaves into that, of the sense he doesn't want really to marry. He's an old man. He's sort of, and he's sort of miracled into marrying her, and then he's presented with the handmaidens as well, and it's sort of I can't even. What's going on? And it's sort of such a weird setup, because it's like we're just going to make it. He's married her, but there's absolutely no way that she's definitely a virgin. Look, there's all these we're going to absolutely lay it on the line. Joseph can't in any way have had sex with Mary, and it's so laboured.
You can see that they had a whole lot of anxiety about this. Wait, she's supposed to be a virgin. Why is she married? Okay, well, let's just make sure that we make it clear that he can't possibly have sex with her, because of course that's what marriage is for. And we don't understand this, so we'll fix it.
Yes.
But I also like the way that tradition takes the fablio genre, right? The body genre that usually is, about cuckoldry, but then it's also very sexist and misogynist often too, right? Men are cuckolds because women are crap, and they're just going to sleep around, and you can't trust them. And it turns that all on its head, right? Because we know the Virgin Mary is a trustworthy woman, and the problem here is not the woman, but the man, right? So all of his doubts, all of his anxieties are his issues, and it's not the women who are the problem, and so the focus is on him.
Yeah, it's interesting in the Chester Eve, at the Fall of Adam and Eve. There's something really interesting about that. I mean, she says almost nothing, which I think is very indicative. But what really comes forcibly across, and it may be with modern eyes, is that Adam is a lying git. Because he sees her and says, "Oh, you're wonderful. I will call you Virago as a name of how wonderful you are." And then 5 minutes later, again, no. A moment I saw her, I knew she was trouble. God, it wasn't nothing to do with me. And it's actually fascinating, showing how weak he is. As a character, and that I found really interesting. I mean, otherwise, Eve, it's odd because she doesn't really say very much at all. I mean, she's spoken about a lot. And that could be a comment you could make about society.
Whereas in York, she's kind of leading the whole narrative, right? And she even, I mean, for good or for ill, Adam says that he'll take the apple at her teaching, right? So she's the one. She convinces him. She makes a persuasive argument. No, it's okay. I mean, she makes the wrong argument, but. She's a central figure there, and again, I think it's more complex. It's not just Eve is bad. Eve is human.
Talking of another female character, Pilate's wife and the Dream of.
Oh yes.
Which is, again, we were talking about really weird things.
Yes.
It's always been one of those plays where I've gone, what? So what's the logic here? It's he wants them to do for the wrong right,
the right thing for the wrong reason. So because you can't see all of God's plan, and again, I think that's the York plays using a figure a female figure to get at what it's like to be human.
Yeah.
Right? We can't see the whole picture, and so we fail. We make errors of judgment because we don't really get it, and that's kind of the human condition. But and her intentions are good, right? This good man
yes.
should not die. Yeah. And, the dream we know it's, wrong because the dream has been inspired by the devil, right? But she doesn't know that. And I think it's also about how, the difficulty of interpretation, right? And the ways in which interpreting the world and interpreting the text and interpreting God's will and all of that is always going to be, we see this through a glass darkly. We're never quite going to get it right because of our fallibility. And I think it's interesting that he, again, uses a woman to do that. On the one hand, that sounds like, misogyny. Women are the fallible ones. But I think the York plays are seeing them as the humans that are, most, as my students would say, relatable.
Yes.
That we can most identify with. And I think the playwrights can be more free with these characters because they're not in the true canonical sacred narrative, right?
Yes. I mean, the men are not relatable.
Right.
I mean, even Jesus isn't relatable.
No. Right. And they have to do what they're written to do, right? You can't play with them. Noah has to build the ark and do what God tells him. Abraham has to almost kill his son and do what God tells him, right? Because that's the sacred text.
Yes.
Christ has to die on the cross. Pilate has to give him up, no matter, how conflicted he might be. And so instead we get Noah's wife and Procula and these other women characters, or again, old Joseph, who the playwrights can play with and bring the humanity to the story.
And Mary to some degree, in the sense that biblically there isn't that much there.
That's true.
I mean, the amount of material that has been loaded onto her over history is fascinating. But possibly outside my remit.
Yeah, a little bit outside of mine too, since I specialize in men. But also, in like the Mary Magdalene play too. I mean, she is the figure of humanity in her doubt and her desire to touch Christ to make sure that it's really him and things like that.
Now, while I've got you, I think, is there anything else specifically about York you would like to talk about that we haven't covered? I think we've done quite well.
Well, one of the things, I think we have. One of the things that I think kind of still astonishes me about it is, and that I point out to my students, is this was a cycle of plays that was produced annually for nearly 200 years. Like, that's an insane amount of dedication and logistics and just, will of the people, right? And then they kept trying to put it on even in the Reformation, right? I mean, it lasted past, well into the 16th century, and they were constantly fighting for the right to do it.
Yes.
There was, petitions to do it, and they didn't get done past the point where it ceased to be played. The dedication to it that the city had and the importance of it to the city is amazing, and it's hard to quite imagine something that there's no real modern analog. No. And I, again, with that longevity and that dedication and the expense and they had to have started planning each year as soon as one of the plays was, or as soon as one of the performances was over. It's like, after Corpus Christi Day, the day after Corpus Christi Day, they had to have said, all right, guild meeting, what are we going to do next year? Let's start planning it now, right?
Well, it's that sense of, once you've got the continuity going, in a sense, there's an ease, because in a sense people will be playing the same or similar parts. It's a matter of who's being turned over and being replaced, and what broke, what needs repairing.
Right. There's a lot of upkeep. Like, we actually have records about that, right? Like, so storing the wagons, repairing the wagons, making sure you have all the stuff, right? And there has to be a new pageant master elected every year. And there is continuity, but there's also still effort.
Oh, absolutely. Right? And that's the thing, is once you start getting people once the incentive to not do it reaches a certain point, it's that interesting thing. It's not enough for people to say, well, we don't think you should be doing these, we should stop doing that. The moment you stop doing it for a year or 2 years, then the incentive to try and get it back, and the fact that they do keep trying really does say, it's something to do with character as well, about identity. Again, because I've been looking more at Chester, it's just the self-mythologizing of the story of how they came to do their cycle.
Yes. Oh, yes.
And
with Chester, there's a lot of that.
And it's that sense of, we've got this snapshot in terms of text of the plays at this point, pretty much. We don't know how, where that text changed over time, or how it changes, or what goes on. We've got this with York. It's quite a specific snapshot, whereas with Chester, it's a mess.
Right. I was going to say, York, it's a 15th century snapshot, right? Like mid 15th century or mid the 1470s, right? Or somewhere in there. And with Chester right there, antiquarian copies made after the fact. So who knows what's going on there, right?
I mean, for working producer, it's great because I can just keep going back and doing slightly different variations. But it is also it's just an absolute nightmare.
You've got multiple texts, which is why I'll never edit Chester.
No, it's
York is nice. There's only one text, so.
Well, I mean, to be fair, we've done our read-throughs now. That means we then can move on to doing basic recordings of the plays, and this year we start on a new cycle to just do read-throughs, and so that's, we're sort of clearing our way through them in a sort of semi-systematic way. But York, in the sense, because it gets done and has quite a modern performance history, is actually, sadly, for our listeners at home, please do and take a pageant and think about staging it in your local theatre or your local street, because they are good. We're trying to convey enthusiasm for our subject, but it's, if in-house, it's not one of these are not plays where I have the same immediate impetus. I don't need to produce, because if you want to buy the texts, there are 4 or 5 different edited versions of a fair chunk of the cycle that you can do something with, and it's and that's great, and it's lovely that there is another version that will be different in some way and is accessible. That's what I love about actually that and the Digby Mary Magdalene by Broadview as well, is that they're specifically designed for people who are not necessarily looking at it as students, perhaps even. That actually,
yes, that's true. Performers could use these as well too.
Which is, from my point of view, that's the point of the exercise.
I
want more people doing plays.
Me too. And I mean, that's what I mean, again, I think mostly about the classroom. Although I make my students perform, I was secondarily thinking about performers and being able to use this to put on the plays too. Oh, and that's the other thing I just wanted to add, just as kind of footnote, and you can use this or not, but when you were talking about the National Theatre actors in the 70s production being pissed, and I was thinking about the different meanings of that in American English versus British English. That's one of the things that I had in mind when I was glossing things, was North American students, because the Oxford edition, doesn't gloss things that my students need glossed, like the word mad, for example, right? Like if my students see madness, they know that means insanity. But if they just see mad, the first thing they think is angry instead of insane. And so, but British students don't need that glossed, and American students do, right? Because of the differences in usage. So I was especially thinking about accessibility to North American students, but hopefully that doesn't make it redundant or annoying to British students.
Well, I don't think so. I mean, every so often I do see glosses in anything and just go, did I need to be told that?
Yeah, you didn't, but my students did.
Yes.
My edition is called the York Corpus Christi play, Selected Pageants. It's a Broadview anthology of medieval drama edition from Broadview Press. It is available. You can order it from them or on Amazon, or get it at your local bookstore. It's widely available. It's in paperback. It's inexpensive and accessible, and is, I think, a terrific introduction to the York plays if you do not know them, or if you do.
And I'd like to thank Dr. Christina M. Fitzgerald for joining me on this episode. Go out and buy the book if you can, and tell us about it at Beyond Shakes. But till next time, I've been your host, Robert Crichton, and you've been listening to the Beyond Shakespeare podcast.